There wasn't a single eye in the room that didn't widen in shock when she walked in. A mother, humble and unassuming, barefoot on the most important day of her son's life. As the murmurs spread like wildfire among the guests, no one could understand why. What could drive a mother to such a decision on a day meant to be perfect? But the true shock was yet to come. As her son took the microphone, his voice trembling with emotion, the room fell into a heavy silence. What he revealed next would shake the very foundation of everyone present, unraveling a secret so powerful that it would leave no heart untouched. This is the story of a love so profound, a sacrifice so unimaginable, that it will force you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about devotion. You won't be able to look away as the truth is uncovered, layer by layer, until the final, heart-wrenching moment. Prepare yourself for a tale that will stay with you long after the credits roll. The warm June sun bathed St. Michael's Church in a golden glow, its majestic spire reaching toward the cloudless Boston sky. Inside, the air buzzed with excitement as guests filed into the ornately decorated sanctuary. Cascades of white roses and delicate baby's breath adorned every pew, their sweet fragrance mingling with the scent of polished wood and anticipation. Ethan Matthews stood at the altar, his hands fidgeting nervously with his perfectly pressed tuxedo. At 28, he was the picture of success, a rising star at one of Boston's most prestigious law firms, with boyish good looks that belied his sharp intellect. His soon-to-be bride, Emily Sinclair, came from old money, her family's name synonymous with New England aristocracy. As the string quartet began a gentle prelude, whispers rippled through the assembled crowd. "Did you see Emily's dress? I heard it cost more than my car. Look at Ethan up there. Poor guy's sweating bullets. Can you believe the Sinclairs rented out the entire 4 seasons for the reception?" The chatter died down as the church doors swung open. Everyone turned, expecting to see the radiant bride. Instead, a collective gasp echoed through the vaulted ceiling. There, framed in the doorway, stood an older woman. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her face bore the gentle creases of a life lived with both laughter and worry. But it wasn't her understated appearance that shocked the crowd. It was her feet. Mary Matthews, mother of the groom, stood barefoot on the cold marble floor. Her simple cotton dress, faded but clean, hung just above her ankles, drawing even more attention to her unshod feet. She clutched a small, worn purse to her chest like a shield. The silence was deafening. Then, like a dam breaking, the whispers began anew, more urgent and scandalized than before. "Is that Ethan's mother? Good Lord, why isn't she wearing shoes? How embarrassing for the family." Mary's eyes, a deep brown that mirrored her son's, scanned the crowd. Her chin lifted slightly, a quiet dignity in her bearing despite the shocked stares. She took a deep breath and began to walk down the aisle, each step echoing in the stunned silence. Ethan's gaze locked onto his mother. For a moment, his carefully cultivated composure cracked. A flash of surprise, quickly followed by a wave of emotion too complex to name, washed over his face. But just as quickly, he schooled his features back into a polite smile. As Mary approached, an usher stepped forward, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Ma'am, perhaps you'd like to, freshen up before the ceremony?" Mary's voice was soft but unwavering. "Thank you, young man, but I'm right where I need to be." She took her place in the front pew, her bare feet a stark contrast to the polished shoes and designer heels surrounding her. The father of the bride, Richard Sinclair, leaned over to his wife, whispering furiously behind his hand. Across the aisle, Emily's bridesmaids exchanged wide-eyed glances, their perfectly manicured hands covering shocked whispers. Ethan's best man, Jake, nudged him gently. "Dude, what's going on? Is your mom okay?" Ethan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "She's fine," he said, his voice tight. "Everything's fine." But the tension in the air was palpable. The once joyous atmosphere now crackled with an undercurrent of discomfort and confusion. The string quartet faltered for a moment before continuing their melody, the notes seeming to hang uncertainly in the air. As if on cue, the church doors swung open once more. This time, it was Emily who appeared, a vision in white lace and silk. Her entrance should have been met with sighs of admiration and misty-eyed smiles. Instead, many gazes were still fixed on the barefoot woman in the front pew. Emily's radiant smile dimmed slightly as she sensed the strange atmosphere. Her eyes found Ethan's, questioning. He gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, silently pleading with her to continue. With each step Emily took down the aisle, the murmurs grew louder. Mary sat still, her back straight, her gaze fixed ahead. But those close enough could see her hands trembling slightly where they rested in her lap. As Emily reached the altar, Ethan took her hand. Their eyes met, a silent conversation passing between them. Emily's gaze flicked briefly to Mary, then back to Ethan. Her brow furrowed slightly, but she squeezed his hand in reassurance. The officiant cleared his throat, his voice ringing out in the uneasy quiet. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." But even as the ceremony began, the questions hung heavy in the air. Why was Mary barefoot? What could have led to this moment? The guests shifted in their seats, their attention divided between the couple exchanging vows and the enigma sitting quietly in the front row. As Ethan and Emily said their "I dose," a single tear rolled down Mary's cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but not before several people noticed. The tear seemed to hold a story, one of joy, perhaps, but also of something deeper, more painful. After the newlyweds shared their first kiss as husband and wife, they turned to face their guests. The applause was enthusiastic but tinged with an undercurrent of confusion and curiosity. Ethan's eyes found his mother's. In that moment, something passed between them, a look of understanding, of shared history, of unspoken truths. Mary nodded almost imperceptibly, and Ethan's shoulders straightened. As the newlyweds began their walk back down the aisle, Ethan surprised everyone by stopping at his mother's pew. He leaned down, kissing her cheek gently. "I love you, Mom," he said, his voice carrying in the hushed church. Mary's eyes welled with tears. "I love you too, my boy," she whispered. The gesture, so simple yet so loaded with meaning, sent a fresh wave of whispers through the congregation. Emily, to her credit, smiled warmly at her new mother-in-law, though confusion still lingered in her eyes. As Ethan and Emily exited the church, the guests began to file out, their excited chatter now mixed with speculation and curiosity. Mary remained seated, allowing the crowd to thin before she stood. An elderly woman paused beside her. "Mary," she said softly, "is everything all right?" Mary looked up, a small, enigmatic smile on her face. "Everything is exactly as it should be, Margaret. Thank you for asking." As the last of the guests departed, Mary finally rose. She stood for a moment, her bare feet on the cold stone floor, gazing at the altar where her son had just been married. Then, with a deep breath, she walked slowly down the aisle and out into the bright summer day. The limo carrying Ethan and Emily to the reception had already departed, but Mary didn't seem to be in any hurry. She walked down the church steps, her head held high, ignoring the curious stares of lingering guests and passers-by on the busy Boston street. As she reached the sidewalk, a gust of wind caught a flyer posted on a nearby lamppost. It fluttered to the ground, landing at Mary's feet. She bent to pick it up, her eyes scanning the text. "Boston Children's Hospital Charity Gala. Help us give kids a brighter future." Mary folded the flyer carefully and tucked it into her purse. Then, with a determined set to her shoulders, she began to walk down the bustling city street, her bare feet carrying her towards a destination known only to her. The questions hung in the air like the fading peals of the church bells. What secret lay behind Mary's barefoot appearance? How would it affect the newlyweds' perfect day? And what revelations awaited the unsuspecting guests at the reception to come? The luxurious ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel buzzed with excitement as guests mingled, cocktails in hand, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the newlyweds. Chandeliers cast a warm glow over the elegantly dressed crowd, their light catching on jewels and cufflinks. But beneath the veneer of celebration, An undercurrent of curiosity and speculation rippled through the room. "Did you see Ethan's mother at the church?" A woman in a designer gown whispered to her companion. "Barefoot? Can you imagine?" Her friend nodded, leaning in conspiratorially. "I heard she's always been different, but this, on her son's wedding day." As conversations swirled around the room, the scene dissolved, transporting us back in time to a small, shabby apartment in South Boston, nearly 3 decades earlier. A much younger Mary Matthews sat at a rickety kitchen table, her head in her hands. The apartment was sparse but meticulously clean. A few toys were neatly arranged in a corner, and a child's drawings adorned the fridge. The clock on the wall read 2:37 a.m. Mary lifted her head, revealing eyes rimmed with exhaustion and grief. She glanced at a framed photo on the counter. A handsome man in a police uniform smiled back at her. Officer James Matthews, killed in the line of duty just 6 months ago. A soft whimper came from the next room. Mary was on her feet in an instant, moving to a small bedroom where a toddler Ethan, barely 3 years old, tossed fitfully in his sleep. "Shoo, baby," Mary soothed, gently stroking his hair. "Mama's here. It's okay." As Ethan settled, Mary's gaze fell on a stack of bills on the nightstand. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of her new reality. A widowed single mother with a mountain of debt and a child to raise. The scene shifted again. Mary, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, scrubbed floors in an opulent Beacon Hill home. Her hands were red and chapped from harsh cleaning chemicals. In the background, a woman's voice carried from another room. "And make sure you get under the radiators this time, Mary. Last week's work was sloppy." Mary bit her lip, swallowing her pride. "Yes, Mrs. Hawthorne, I'll do better." Later that evening, Mary trudged up the stairs to her apartment, her body aching from a long day of cleaning. She opened the door to find Mrs. Sullivan, their elderly neighbor, sitting with a now 7-year-old Ethan. "How was he?" Mary asked, dropping her bag and kneeling to hug her son. Mrs. Sullivan smiled warmly. "An angel, as always. He finished all his homework." Mary reached for her purse, but Mrs. Sullivan waved her off. "Don't you worry about that, dear. You keep your money. I know things are tight." Tears welled in Mary's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." After Mrs. Sullivan left, Mary sat with Ethan as he proudly showed her his homework. "Look, Mom, I got all A's on my spelling test." Mary's face lit up with pride. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You're so smart. Just like your daddy." Ethan's smile faltered slightly. "I wish I could remember him better." Mary pulled him close, blinking back tears. "He'd be so proud of you, Ethan. So proud." As Ethan drifted off to sleep that night, Mary sat at the kitchen table, poring over bills and job listings. Her gaze fell on a flyer for art classes at the local community center. For a moment, her eyes sparkled with a hint of long-buried dreams. Then, with a heavy sigh, she crumpled the flyer and tossed it in the trash. The years flew by in a montage of sacrifice and struggle. Mary working multiple jobs, often coming home long after Ethan was asleep. Ethan growing taller, his school achievements piling up. Mary, declining invitations to school events because she couldn't afford to take time off work. Ethan, understanding beyond his years, hugging her tightly and saying, "It's okay, Mom. I know you're working hard for us." One pivotal moment stood out. Ethan, now 16, burst into their small apartment, waving a letter excitedly. Mom, I got in. Full scholarship to Boston Latin." Mary's face lit up with joy and pride. She hugged him fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Ethan, I'm so proud of you." As they celebrated, neither noticed the envelope that had fallen from Mary's bag. A past due notice from their landlord, threatening eviction. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Mary sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen. She held a small velvet box, open to reveal a delicate gold locket, her mother's, the only heirloom she had left. Her fingers traced the intricate design, memories flooding back. With a deep breath, She closed the box and slipped it into her purse. The next day, she'd visit the pawn shop. Ethan's future was worth far more than any piece of jewelry. The scene shifted one last time, bringing us to just days before the wedding. Mary stood in a small, cluttered pawn shop, the same velvet box on the counter before her. The shopkeeper, an older man with kind eyes, looked at her sympathetically. "You sure about this, Mary? I know how much this means to you." Mary nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's for Ethan's wedding. He wants everything to be perfect for Emily." As she left the shop, the weight of the cash in her purse felt both comforting and painful. She'd given up her last treasure, but the thought of Ethan's happiness made it worthwhile. Back in the present, the ballroom at the Four Seasons fell suddenly quiet as the DJ announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome for the first time, Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Matthews." Ethan and Emily entered, resplendent and beaming. But as they made their way to the center of the room, Ethan's eyes scanned the crowd, searching. His smile faltered slightly when he didn't see what, or who, he was looking for. Emily squeezed his hand, a question in her eyes. Ethan leaned in, whispering something in her ear. She nodded, understanding and concern mingling in her expression. As the newlyweds took their place for their first dance, the guests crowded around, smiling and taking photos. But at the back of the room, unnoticed by most, a door opened quietly. Mary slipped in, still barefoot, her face a complex mixture of emotions, pride, love, and a touch of something that looked almost like shame. She stood in the shadows, watching her son dance with his new bride, tears glistening in her eyes. The mother's silent sacrifice hung in the air, an unspoken story waiting to be told. And as the evening progressed, the tension built, a secret on the verge of being revealed, a truth that would change everything in an instant. The elegant ballroom of the Four Seasons swirled with music and laughter as the wedding reception hit its stride. Crystal glasses clinked, camera flashes popped, and the dance floor pulsed with energy. In the center of it all, Ethan and Emily moved from table to table, greeting guests with bright smiles and warm embraces. But beneath Ethan's polished exterior, a war raged within. His eyes kept darting to the edges of the room, searching for a glimpse of his mother. The weight of unspoken truths pressed heavily on his chest, threatening to burst forth at any moment. As the evening wore on, the time came for speeches. The father of the bride, Richard Sinclair, took the microphone first. His booming voice filled the room as he regaled the crowd with anecdotes about Emily's childhood and playful warnings for Ethan. The guests laughed and applauded, caught up in the joyous atmosphere. Next came Jake, Ethan's best man and oldest friend. He kept his speech light and humorous, poking fun at Ethan's workaholic tendencies and recounting embarrassing stories from their college days. But as Jake wrapped up, he said something that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. "And Ethan, buddy, I know your mom couldn't be here tonight, but I'm sure she's incredibly proud of the man you've become." A ripple of confused murmurs swept through the crowd. Those who had been at the church exchanged puzzled glances, while others who had only attended the reception looked around in bewilderment. Emily, sensing the shift in mood, squeezed Ethan's hand reassuringly, but she couldn't hide the question in her eyes. They hadn't had a moment alone since the ceremony, and Ethan's odd behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. As Jake handed over the microphone, Ethan stood slowly. He straightened his tie, a gesture that seemed more about buying time than adjusting his appearance. The room fell silent, all eyes on the groom. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate with Emily and me," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions behind his eyes. "Your love and support mean the world to us." He paused, taking a deep breath. In that moment, his gaze locked onto a figure standing near the back of the room. Mary had emerged from the shadows, her bare feet peeking out from beneath her simple dress. Their eyes met, and a lifetime of unspoken understanding passed between them. Ethan's shoulders straightened, resolve hardening his features. "Before we continue the festivities, there's something I need to say, something important." The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. Emily looked up at her new husband, a mix of concern and curiosity on her face. Many of you were at the church earlier and noticed something unusual. Ethan's voice wavered slightly. My mother arrived barefoot. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. All eyes turned to Mary, who stood tall despite the attention. Her chin lifted in quiet dignity. I know there have been whispers, questions, assumptions made. Ethan continued. But the truth is, none of you know the real story. And it's time you did. He stepped away from the head table, moving to stand in the center of the room. The spotlight followed him, casting a warm glow that seemed to isolate him from the crowd. My mother, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion, is the strongest, most selfless person I know. And the reason she's barefoot today, the reason she looks out of place in this room full of designer dresses and custom suits, is because of me. A confused murmur rippled through the guests. Emily's brow furrowed, her eyes darting between Ethan and Mary. 3 days ago, Ethan continued, his voice gaining strength, my mother sold the only valuable thing she owned, a gold locket that had been in our family for generations. She sold it to help pay for this wedding, to make sure everything was perfect for Emily and me. Gasps and whispers erupted around the room. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. But that's not all, Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly. That locket, it was the last thing she had left to sell, because every other possession, every penny she's ever earned, has gone towards giving me a better life. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes, but he blinked them back, determined to finish. When I was 3 years old, my father, a police officer, was killed in the line of duty. From that day forward, my mother worked multiple jobs, often going without food herself to make sure I never went hungry. She sacrificed her own dreams, her own comfort, everything, for me. Mary stood still as a statue, tears streaming silently down her face. Several guests were openly crying now, the gravity of Ethan's words sinking in. She sold her wedding ring to pay for my first suit when I interviewed for college scholarships. She pawned our television so I could have a computer for school. And now she sold the last piece of her past so that I could have the future of my dreams. Ethan's voice broke, and he took a moment to compose himself. The room was dead silent, every person hanging on his words. I didn't know about the locket until this morning, he admitted. And when I found out, I was ashamed, not of her, never of her, but of myself, for not seeing, for not understanding the true depth of her sacrifice. He turned to face Mary directly, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. Mom, I am so sorry. I'm sorry for every time I complained about what we didn't have. I'm sorry for every sacrifice you made that I took for granted. And I'm sorry that I ever made you feel like you weren't good enough, just as you are, for my wedding day. Mary stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet. She reached for Ethan, and he enveloped her in a fierce hug. The room erupted in applause, many guests on their feet, tears in their eyes. As mother and son embraced, Emily rose from her seat. She walked to them, her elaborate wedding gown a stark contrast to Mary's simple dress. Without hesitation, she joined the hug, wrapping her arms around both Ethan and Mary. When they finally separated, Ethan turned back to the crowd, his arms still around his mother's shoulders. I wanted you all to know the truth, to understand that true wealth isn't about designer labels or fancy venues. It's about love, sacrifice, and the willingness to give everything for those you care about. He looked at Mary, then at Emily, his voice filled with determination. And I promise, here and now, to live my life in a way that honors that lesson, to never forget where I came from, and to always appreciate the sacrifices that brought me here. As Ethan's words hung in the air, the atmosphere in the ballroom had transformed. The superficial glamour of the evening had been stripped away, replaced by a profound sense of humility and gratitude. The truth was out, laid bare for all to see. But as the initial shock began to fade, new questions arose. How would this revelation change the dynamics between Ethan, Emily, and their families? What would happen next in this unexpected turn of events? The night was far from over, and the story of the barefoot mother and her devoted son was only beginning to unfold. The ballroom of the Four Seasons, once a swirling hub of celebration, now stood frozen in a moment of profound emotional revelation. Ethan's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of unspoken sacrifice and love. For several heartbeats, no one moved, as if afraid to break the spell of raw honesty that had descended upon the gathering. It was Emily who finally shattered the silence. Still standing next to Ethan and Mary, she turned to face the crowd, her voice quavering but resolute. I had no idea," she began, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Mary, I can't even begin to express how deeply sorry I am for not understanding, for not seeing." She took Mary's hand in hers, squeezing it gently. The contrast between Emily's perfectly manicured nails and Mary's work-worn hands was stark, a visual representation of the gulf between their lives that Ethan's revelation had just bridged. From his seat at the head table, Richard Sinclair, Emily's father, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well," he said, his booming voice somewhat subdued, "this is certainly unexpected." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd at his words. Some guests nodded in agreement, while others shot him disapproving looks. Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Emily turned to face her father. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "What's unexpected is that we've been so blind, that we've been so caught up in our own world that we couldn't see the incredible woman standing right in front of us." Richard shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. His wife, Caroline, placed a hand on his arm, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. As the gravity of the situation sank in, the guests began to talk amongst themselves, their whispers growing louder with each passing moment. "Can you believe it? All this time, I feel terrible for judging her earlier. But why didn't Ethan say something sooner?" Amidst the growing chatter, Jake, Ethan's best man, stood up abruptly. "Hey!" he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. "Isn't this supposed to be a celebration? Ethan and Emily just got married. For crying out loud." His words seemed to break the tension. The band, sensing the shift in mood, struck up a lively tune. Slowly, hesitantly, couples began to make their way to the dance floor. Ethan turned to his mother, his eyes still bright with emotion. "Mom," he said softly, "would you do me the honor of this dance?" Mary looked up at her son, a tremulous smile on her face. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, "I don't know if I should. I'm not dressed for dash. You're perfect just as you are." Ethan interrupted gently. He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Mary took it. As Ethan led his mother onto the dance floor, their barefoot waltz became a powerful symbol of love and acceptance. Guests watched, many wiping away tears, as mother and son swayed to the music, years of unspoken words passing between them in silent understanding. Emily stood at the edge of the dance floor, watching her new husband and mother-in-law with a mix of admiration and something akin to envy. She jumped slightly when she felt a hand on her shoulder. "Emily," Caroline Sinclair said softly, "I think perhaps we owe Mary an apology." Emily nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Yes, Mom, we do." As the song came to an end, Emily and her mother approached Ethan and Mary. The four of them stood in a small circle, the rest of the reception seeming to fade away. "Mary," Caroline began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant, I'm so sorry. We've been so wrong, so judgmental." Mary shook her head, a gentle smile on her face. "There's no need to apologize. You didn't know." "But we should have," Emily insisted. "We should have asked, should have tried to understand instead of just assuming." As they talked, Richard Sinclair watched from the head table, his expression unreadable. He stood slowly, straightening his expensive suit, and made his way towards the small group. The room seemed to hold its breath as Richard approached. He cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Mary," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "I owe you an apology. Your son, Ethan, he's a fine man, and now I understand why. You've done an incredible job, under circumstances I can't even imagine." Mary's eyes widened in surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Sinclair," she said softly. "That means a great deal." As the Sinclairs and Mary continued to talk, Ethan felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Jake standing there, a concerned look on his face. "Ethan, man," Jake said in a low voice, "I think you might want to check your phone. There's something you need to see." Frowning, Ethan pulled out his phone. His eyes widened as he saw the notifications flooding his screen. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of text messages, and, "Oh no," Ethan breathed. Jake nodded grimly. "Yeah, someone recorded your speech and posted it online. It's going viral, Ethan. Like millions of views in the last hour viral." Ethan's mind raced. The intensely personal moment he had shared, the private pain and triumph of his mother's story, was now out there for the world to see. He looked up, his eyes finding Mary across the room. She was smiling, laughing at something Emily had said, looking more relaxed than he had seen her in years. In that moment, Ethan realized that the consequences of his revelation were only beginning to unfold. The truth was out not just to their guests but to the world. And as he watched his mother, barefoot and beautiful in her simple dress, surrounded by people who were finally seeing her for who she truly was, Ethan knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The night was far from over, and the story of the barefoot mother at the society wedding was about to take on a life of its own. As Ethan's phone continued to buzz with notifications, he squared his shoulders, ready to face whatever came next, together with his new wife, and with the incredible woman who had sacrificed everything to get him here. The opulent ballroom of the Four Seasons, once a sanctuary of celebration, now thrummed with an undercurrent of tension. As news of the viral video spread among the guests, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Hushed conversations and furtive glances at phones replaced the earlier jovial mood. Ethan stood at the edge of the dance floor, his phone clutched tightly in his hand, a maelstrom of emotions playing across his face. Emily approached him, concern etched in her delicate features. "Ethan, what's wrong?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on his arm. He turned to her, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and growing anxiety. "The speech, someone recorded it. It's everywhere, Emily. Social media, news sites, everywhere." Emily's gasp was barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. "Oh my God," she breathed. How bad is it?" Before Ethan could respond, a commotion near the entrance to the ballroom caught their attention. A small group of guests had gathered around someone who had just entered, a man in a sharp suit, his face flushed with barely contained anger. "Where is he?" the man demanded, his voice carrying across the room. "Where's Ethan?" Emily's grip on Ethan's arm tightened. Is that Uncle Robert?" Ethan nodded grimly. Robert Sinclair, Emily's uncle and a prominent figure in Boston's social circles, was known for his sharp tongue and even sharper business practices. His presence at the wedding had been a point of contention during the planning stages, with Emily insisting on inviting him despite her parents' reservations. As Robert's gaze locked onto Ethan, he began striding purposefully across the room, leaving a wake of whispers behind him. "Ethan Matthews," Robert's voice boomed, silencing the band and drawing all eyes to the unfolding drama. "What in God's name were you thinking?" Mary, who had been chatting quietly with Caroline Sinclair, turned at the sound of Robert's voice. Her face paled as she saw the angry man approaching her son. Ethan straightened his shoulders, stepping slightly in front of Emily. "Uncle Robert," he said, his voice calm despite the tension evident in his posture. "What seems to be the problem?" Robert's face reddened further. "The problem," he sputtered, "the problem is that you've turned this wedding, a celebration of two of Boston's finest families, into some kind of poverty-porn spectacle." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Emily's hand flew to her mouth in shock, while Ethan's jaw clenched visibly. "How dare you?" Ethan began, his voice low and dangerous, but before he could continue, another voice cut through the tension. "That's quite enough, Robert." All eyes turned to see Richard Sinclair striding towards the confrontation, his face a mask of controlled anger. He positioned himself between Robert and the newlyweds, his imposing figure a physical barrier. "This is my daughter's wedding," Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "and I won't have you ruining it with your misguided opinions." Robert's eyes widened in disbelief. "Misguided? Richard, surely you can see what a disaster this is. The press will have a field day. The Sinclair name will be dragged through the mud. All because your new son-in-law couldn't keep his family's dirty laundry to himself." The room fell deathly silent. Even the waitstaff froze, trays of champagne forgotten in their hands. It was Mary who broke the silence. She stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet. Despite her simple attire, there was a regal quality to her bearing as she faced Robert Sinclair. "Mr. Sinclair," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "my son shared our story not to create a spectacle, but to honor the truth. If that truth makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should examine why." Robert's face contorted with fury. "How dare you lecture me, you... Enough!" Emily's voice rang out, surprisingly forceful. She moved to stand beside Mary, linking their arms in a show of solidarity. "Uncle Robert, if you can't respect my husband, my new mother-in-law, and the choices we've made for our wedding, then perhaps you should leave." The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited to see how Robert would respond. His eyes darted from face to face, Emily's defiant glare, Ethan's clenched jaw, Mary's quiet dignity, Richard's stern disapproval. Finally, with a huff of disgust, Robert turned on his heel. "This isn't over." He spat over his shoulder as he stormed towards the exit. As the door slammed behind him, the room erupted into a cacophony of voices. Guests huddled in small groups, furiously discussing what had just transpired. The Sinclair family members present looked shell-shocked, while Ethan's colleagues from the law firm whispered urgently amongst themselves. Amidst the chaos, Ethan turned to Mary, his eyes filled with a mix of love and anguish. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I wanted people to know how amazing you are." Mary cupped her son's face in her hands, a sad smile playing on her lips. "Oh, sweetheart, you have nothing to apologize for. The truth will always have consequences, but that doesn't make it any less important to tell." As they embraced, Emily's phone buzzed insistently. She glanced at the screen, her eyes widening. "Ethan," she said, her voice tight with worry, It's getting worse. The story's being picked up by major news outlets. They're calling it the Barefoot bride's mother scandal." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The personal moment he had shared, meant to honor his mother, was spiraling out of control. The fallout was affecting not just him and Mary, but the Sinclairs, his law firm, and who knew how many others. As the newly formed family huddled together, the weight of what was to come pressed down upon them. The night that had begun as a celebration of love had transformed into something far more complex, a crucible that would test the bonds of family, the power of truth, and the true meaning of wealth and status in a world quick to judge and slow to understand. The tension in the room continued to build, a powder keg of emotions and conflicting loyalties just waiting for the next spark to ignite it. And as Ethan looked around at the faces of those he loved most in the world, he knew that the hardest part of their journey was still to come. As the tension in the ballroom reached a fever pitch, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A distinguished-looking older gentleman with salt and pepper hair pushed his way through the crowd, his eyes scanning the room urgently. "Mary?" he called out, his voice cutting through the din. "Mary Matthews?" The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Mary. She stood frozen, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. "Thomas?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan looked between his mother and the stranger, confusion etched on his face. "Mom? Who is this?" Before Mary could respond, the man Thomas reached them. He stood before Mary, his eyes drinking in the sight of her as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. "My God, Mary," he breathed. "After all these years." Mary's hand trembled as she reached out, almost touching Thomas's face before pulling back. How are you here?" Thomas smiled sadly. "I saw the video, your son's speech. It's everywhere. I couldn't believe it when I saw your face. I thought you were gone." The guests watched in stunned silence as this unexpected drama unfolded. Emily clutched Ethan's arm, her eyes wide with confusion and concern. Ethan stepped forward, placing himself slightly between his mother and the stranger. "I'm sorry, but who exactly are you?" Thomas tore his gaze from Mary to look at Ethan. His eyes widened in recognition. "You must be Ethan," he said softly. "You look so much like your father." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Ethan's face paled. You knew my father?" Mary's voice shook as she spoke. "Ethan, this is Thomas Reeves. He was your father's partner on the police force." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Whispers erupted among the guests, theories and speculations flying. Thomas nodded solemnly. "James was more than my partner. He was my best friend. And Mary." He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and longing. "Mary was like family to us both." Mary's composure, which had held strong through all the earlier revelations, finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she looked at Thomas. "We thought you were dead," she whispered. "After James, after the shooting, they told us you were gone too." The pieces started to fall into place in Ethan's mind. "Wait," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the Thomas from the stories? The one who saved Dad's life in that bank robbery. But Mom, you always said he died in the line of duty too." Thomas shook his head, a pained expression on his face. "I didn't die, but a part of me wished I had. The night James was killed, I was there, Ethan. I saw it happen. I couldn't save him." The ballroom was dead silent now, every person hanging on every word of this unexpected revelation. "After that night," Thomas continued, his voice heavy with regret, "I couldn't face anyone, not my fellow officers, not James's family. Especially not Mary and little Ethan. I was a coward. I ran, changed my name, moved across the country. I've spent the last 25 years trying to forget, trying to outrun the guilt." Mary reached out, grasping Thomas's hand. "It wasn't your fault, Thomas. James wouldn't have blamed you. We missed you so much." Ethan's mind reeled. The story of his father's death, a cornerstone of his childhood, was suddenly thrown into a new light. He looked at his mother, seeing years of hidden pain in her eyes. "Mom," he said softly, "why didn't you ever tell me?" Mary turned to her son, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions. "Oh, Ethan, I wanted to protect you, and I think a part of me couldn't bear to relive those memories. It was easier to let Thomas be a hero in death than to face the pain of his absence in life." As the gravity of the situation sank in, Emily stepped forward. "Mr. Reeves," she said gently, "would you like to sit down? I think we all have a lot to talk about." Thomas nodded gratefully, and the small group moved to a quiet corner of the ballroom. The other guests, sensing the need for privacy, respectfully kept their distance, though curious glances were thrown their way. As they sat, Ethan's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, his eyes widening. "Oh no," he murmured. "What is it?" Emily asked, concern lacing her voice. Ethan looked up, his face pale. "The story, it's evolved. Someone recognized Thomas from the video. They're calling it The Barefoot Bride's Mother and the Resurrected Hero Cop. It's everywhere." The implications of this new development hung heavy in the air. What had started as a simple, heartfelt revelation had snowballed into a media frenzy, unearthing long-buried secrets and threatening to change the lives of everyone involved. As Mary, Thomas, Ethan, and Emily huddled together, The weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future pressed down upon them. The night was far from over, and the story of the barefoot mother, the devoted son, and the long-lost family friend was about to take yet another unexpected turn. In the background, the wedding reception continued, but for the people in that quiet corner, the world had shifted on its axis. The truth, once hidden, was now laid bare for all to see, its consequences rippling out in ways none of them could have anticipated. The opulent ballroom of the Four Seasons, once alive with celebration, now hummed with a tense energy. In a secluded corner, Ethan, Emily, Mary, and the newly arrived Thomas sat huddled together, their voices low but intense. The weight of decades of secrets and unspoken truths hung heavily in the air between them. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Thomas. "So all this time, you've been alive, living your life while my mom struggled to raise me alone." His voice trembled with a mix of anger and disbelief. Thomas flinched at the accusation in Ethan's tone. "I know I can never make up for what I did," he said softly. "But you have to understand, Ethan. That night, it broke something in me." Mary reached out, placing a gentle hand on Thomas's arm. "Tell him, Thomas. Tell him everything." Thomas took a deep breath, his eyes distant as he recalled that fateful night. "We'd gotten a call about a robbery in progress. James and we were first on the scene. We thought we had it under control, but then his voice broke, and he paused to compose himself. Emily quietly handed him a glass of water, her face a mask of sympathy. "One of the robbers had a hostage," Thomas continued after a moment. "James, your father, he tried to negotiate. He was always so good at talking people down. But this time," Ethan's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists. "The shooter came out of nowhere," he said, reciting the story he'd been told countless times. "Dad never had a chance." Thomas nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "That's what they told you. But the truth is, I saw the shooter. I had a clear shot, but I hesitated for just a split second." And in that moment, the implications of Thomas's words hung in the air like a physical presence. Ethan's face paled as the full weight of the revelation hit him. "You could have saved him," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "You could have saved my father." Mary's grip on Thomas's arm tightened. "Ethan, no, it wasn't like that. Thomas, tell him." Thomas shook his head, his face a mask of anguish. "She's trying to protect me, Ethan. But the truth is, your mother's right. I could have taken the shot. I should have taken the shot. But I was afraid. And because of my fear, your father paid the ultimate price." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Several nearby guests turned to look, but quickly averted their eyes from the intense scene. "Ethan, please," Emily said softly, reaching for her husband's hand. But Ethan pulled away, his eyes never leaving Thomas. "Do you know what we went through?" Ethan's voice was low, dangerous. "Do you have any idea what it was like for us? The nights Mom went hungry so I could eat, the birthdays with no presents, the constant struggle, the sacrifices, the pain." Thomas bowed his head, unable to meet Ethan's gaze. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I've carried this guilt every day for the past 25 years. Mary stood, placing herself between Ethan and Thomas. "Sweetheart, please. This isn't what your father would have wanted. He loved Thomas like a brother. He would have forgiven him." Ethan's eyes flashed with anger. "How can you say that? How can you defend him? He left us, Mom. He abandoned us when we needed him most." The commotion had drawn attention. Richard and Caroline Sinclair approached cautiously, concern etched on their faces. "Is everything all right here?" Richard asked, his eyes darting between the tense figures. Emily stepped in, her voice calm despite the turmoil. "It's okay, Dad. We're just working through some things." But Ethan wasn't finished. He turned to his new in-laws, his voice bitter. "Did you know about this?" Did everyone know about this except me? Caroline's brow furrowed in confusion. Know about what, dear? We're as surprised as you are by all of this. As the tension mounted, a new voice cut through the chaos. Ethan Matthews, that is enough. All eyes turned to Mary. She stood tall, her bare feet planted firmly on the plush carpet, her eyes blazing with a fire that few had ever seen. In that moment, she was no longer the timid, barefoot woman who had caused such a stir earlier. She was a force of nature, a mother protecting her family. All of her family. You listen to me, young man, Mary continued, her voice strong and clear. I have spent the last 25 years of my life making sure you had every opportunity, every chance at happiness. And I have never, not once, regretted a single sacrifice I made for you. Ethan's anger faltered in the face of his mother's intensity. But Mom, no buts, Mary interrupted. Thomas made a mistake. Terrible, painful mistake. But he's suffered for it every day since. And now he's here, facing his fears, facing us. That takes courage, Ethan. The kind of courage your father always admired. The ballroom had fallen silent, all attention focused on the unfolding drama. Even the band had stopped playing, the musicians watching with rapt attention. Mary took a deep breath, her voice softening. Your father wasn't perfect, Ethan. None of us are. But he believed in forgiveness. He believed in second chances. And if he were here right now, he'd be the first to welcome Thomas back with open arms. Tears streamed down Thomas's face as he listened to Mary's words. Ethan stood frozen, a maelstrom of emotions playing across his features. Emily stepped forward, gently taking Ethan's hand. She's right, love, she said softly. This is a chance to heal old wounds, to fill in the missing pieces of your past. Don't let anger rob you of this opportunity. For a long moment, no one moved. The entire reception seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how Ethan would respond. Finally, Ethan's shoulders sagged. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a look of exhaustion and, perhaps, a glimmer of understanding. He turned to Thomas, his voice hoarse with emotion. Tell me about him, Ethan said quietly. Tell me about my father, the parts one never knew. Thomas nodded, a sad smile crossing his face. He was the best man I ever knew, Ethan, and he would be so proud of the man you've become. As Ethan sank back into his chair, the tension in the room began to dissipate. Mary sat beside her son, taking his hand in hers. Emily and Thomas joined them, forming a small circle of shared history and newfound understanding. The band, sensing the shift in mood, began to play again, a soft, melancholic tune that seemed to capture the bittersweet nature of the moment. As the night wore on, the story of the barefoot mother, the long-lost friend, and the son caught between past and present continued to unfold. But now, amidst the pain and revelations, a small seed of healing had been planted. The wedding reception swirled around them, but for the small group in the corner, time seemed to stand still. They had embarked on a journey of truth and reconciliation, one that would change all of their lives in ways they had yet to fully comprehend. As the night deepened, the opulent ballroom of the Four Seasons took on an almost dreamlike quality. The soft glow of chandeliers cast gentle shadows, and the murmur of conversations blended with the mellow tunes from the band. In their secluded corner, Ethan, Emily, Mary, and Thomas continued their intense discussion, their voices low but charged with emotion. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The anger that had consumed him earlier had subsided, replaced by a complex mix of emotions he was still struggling to process. I don't know how to feel about all of this, he admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Emily squeezed his hand supportively. It's okay, love. This is a lot to take in. Mary nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. Ethan, sweetheart, I know this isn't how you imagined your wedding day, but sometimes life has a way of bringing us exactly what we need, even if we don't recognize it at first. Thomas cleared his throat, his face etched with lines of regret and hope. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, he said softly. But I want you both to know that not a day has gone by that I haven't thought of you, of James, of the life we all should have had together. As they talked, a commotion near the entrance caught their attention. A young woman in a server's uniform was arguing with the event coordinator, her voice rising in frustration. Please, I just need 5 minutes. It's important. Curious, Emily stood up. Excuse me, she said, approaching the pair. Is everything all right? The young server turned, her eyes widening as she recognized the bride. Mrs. Matthews, I'm so sorry to disturb you, but I saw the video, the one of your husband's speech. Emily's brow furrowed in concern. Oh, I see. And the server, whose name tag read Sophie, took a deep breath. It's just, my mom, she's been working 3 jobs to put me through college. When I saw that video, saw Mrs. Matthews, she gestured towards Mary. I called my mom. I told her how much I love her, how much I appreciate everything she's done for me. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. I've never done that before. I've always been so focused on what we didn't have, on trying to fit in with my richer classmates. But hearing your husband's story, it made me realize how blind I've been. By this point, Ethan, Mary, and Thomas had joined them, drawn by the intensity of Sophie's words. Mary stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet. Oh, sweetheart, she said softly, taking Sophie's hands in hers. Your mother is so lucky to have you. Sophie shook her head, a watery smile on her face. No, Mrs. Matthews, I'm the lucky one, and I wanted to thank you. Your story, it's changing lives, not just mine. The video, it's gone beyond viral. People all over the country are sharing their own stories of sacrifice and love. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. He pulled out his phone, quickly scrolling through social media. What he saw left him speechless. Thousands of posts, all with the hashtag #BarefootLove, filled his feed. Stories of single parents, of families overcoming hardship, of children recognizing their parents' sacrifices, all inspired by Mary's story. Mom, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. Look at this. As Mary read through the posts, tears began to fall freely down her cheeks. Thomas placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glistening. Emily turned to Sophie, a warm smile on her face. Thank you for sharing this with us. It means more than you know. Suddenly, Richard Sinclair's voice boomed across the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? All eyes turned to Emily's father, who stood in the center of the room, microphone in hand. Tonight has been unexpected, to say the least, Richard began, a wry smile on his face. But as I've watched these events unfold, I've come to realize something important. He paused, his eyes finding Mary in the crowd. Mrs. Matthews, when you walked into that church today, barefoot and humble, many of us judged you. We saw only what was on the surface. But your son's words, and your own quiet dignity, have shown us the true meaning of wealth. Richard's voice grew passionate. Wealth isn't about the shoes on our feet or the labels on our clothes. It's about the love in our hearts, the strength of our character, and the sacrifices we're willing to make for those we care about. He raised his glass high. So I'd like to propose a toast to Mary Matthews, whose barefoot walk down the aisle has taught us all to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, or lack thereof. And to Ethan and Emily, may your marriage be built on the same foundation of love, sacrifice, and understanding that Mary has demonstrated. The room erupted in applause. Guests raised their glasses, many wiping away tears. As the celebration resumed with renewed vigor, Ethan turned to his mother, his eyes shining with a new understanding. Mom, he said softly, I am so sorry for every time I complained, for every sacrifice I took for granted. You are the strongest, most amazing person I know. Mary cupped her son's face in her hands, a tender smile on her lips. Oh, my sweet boy, you have nothing to be sorry for. Every sacrifice, every hardship, it was all worth it to see the man you've become. Emily linked her arm through Ethan's, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And what a man he is," she said softly. "Kind, compassionate, and brave enough to speak his truth." Thomas cleared his throat. "James would be so proud," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "of both of you." As they stood there, this unlikely family brought together by chance and choice, Mary looked down at her bare feet. "You know," she said with a small laugh, "I think I'll keep the shoes off. They're a good reminder of where we've been and how far we've come." Ethan grinned, slipping off his own expensive dress shoes. "You know what, Mom? I think I'll join you." One by one, Emily, Thomas, and even Richard and Caroline Sinclair followed suit. Soon, the entire wedding party was barefoot, laughing and dancing without a care for status or appearance. As the night wore on, the story of the barefoot mother and her son's wedding continued to spread, touching hearts and changing lives far beyond the walls of the Four Seasons. It served as a powerful reminder that true wealth lies not in material possessions, but in the love we share, the sacrifices we make, and the connections we forge with one another. And in that grand ballroom, surrounded by friends old and new, Mary Matthews danced with joy in her heart and the cool marble floor beneath her bare feet, a symbol of resilience, love, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.